Hey, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co., and today we're diving into the nature of board game publishers, retailers, crowdfunding customers, all of those things and more. This is a viewer-requested video from Chris, who reached out to me after the Forsaken campaign and the delivery or whatnot Forsaken, the pricing from Game Nerds. For some context, to give you some updated information, the very short version is Forsaken ran a campaign, or I should say Game Nerds ran, no, not Game Nerds, Game Trayz, there's so many things here, Game Trayz ran a campaign for a game called Forsaken. Part of what they tried to guarantee backers is that the price plus shipping from the campaign should be a better price point than getting it at retail, as ideally as an incentive for you to have backed the campaign doing the crowdfunding campaign. Then Game Nerds got an exclusive deal for the game, put it on pre-order, and the price was less than what backers paid for it. Price plus shipping, not just price alone, price plus shipping was less than what backers paid for it. Which is tricky, because Game Nerds has specifically said they were trying to make sure it's the best price point, and now the price at retail was cheaper. And so Game Nerds, they kind of reached out to Game Trayz, reached out to Game Nerds. I may have mixed this up a few times. Game Trayz reached out to Game Nerds. They managed to get the price changed, and they put in the updates. Yes, we managed to preserve our commitment to our backers, and we have gotten Game Nerds to raise their price point, which resulted in some degree of appreciation and a lot of degree of weird feelings, which are all understandable. And that's why Chris reached out, because it's a weird situation. Like, we've successfully convinced Game Nerds to raise the price for other people who are trying to get the game. So effectively, Game Nerds, the game store, is going to get more money, or Game Trayz, don't know the exact arrangement there. Game Trayz, Game Nerds, they're going to get more money, and the game is going to be more expensive. This is a success story for backers everywhere. You have successfully convinced the company to raise the price on the product. All backers are happy now. It's a weird story. It's a weird dynamic. It's a weird situation, and it is, make no mistake, a weird situation. The best situation there would have been to never have had the price lower so that you couldn't tout raising the price as a success story. That would have been the best ideal outcome there. But it is a complicated situation, which is why we're diving into this video. Chris kind of said, hey, like, what are your thoughts on this whole situation? What's the story? How do you balance, retailers, publishers, all that stuff? What's going on here? And so to that end, we're going to do a bit of a deeper dive conversation into the nature of being a board game publisher and the nature of serving two masters, trying to get your game produced and crowdfunded, and then trying to have a long product life cycle. Because make no mistake, this is a conversation around serving two masters. And it's not that you can't ever have a situation of serving two masters, it just means that there's often compromise when you're doing so. And the compromise doesn't necessarily go the direction you want it to go. So we're going to dive into the general structure of what a creator's trying to do, what a board game creator's trying to do, what a board game publisher is trying to do. We're going to talk about the nature of crowdfunding versus retail availability. We're going to talk about some of the things creators can do, what the end life cycle tends to look like, or what the ecosystem, what the ecosystem looks like. And let's go ahead and start off with the basics. The basic idea is you have and timestamps to everything down below. The basic idea you're always going to face is you have someone trying to make a game and create that game and sell that game. That's the basic problem. Now, the first problem you're going to run into is if you're trying to do it on your own, there's very often very little money involved in that conversation. Most people cannot simply produce a game. You have to have money to produce a game, or you have to turn around and sell it to a publisher, which is a route some people take. You take your game, you take your design, you work with the publisher makes that game, AEG is making your game, or CGE is making your game, anything with three letters initials, Chip Theory, no, CTG is making your game, all the three letters with all the C's are making your game, or the all C's, AEG, C, there's G, the game makes sense, the game is the common initial. But either way, you have a company produce your game. That's option one. It's also a very hard option. It's a very hard option to actually get that to work. FFG can produce your game, another G. So that's not always the route that's taken. A very common route that's been taken for the past 10 plus years at this point is crowdfunding your game. You can go ahead and make your own game. You can go ahead and bring it to the audience. You can crowdfund it, and therefore your game can come to life, which is great. But if you're operating on a longer term cycle, you also want your game in retail. And crowdfunding operates in so many ways at this point. There's so many things that crowdfunding does. It is an opportunity to raise money. It's a marketing opportunity. But one of the things it also is, it's an opportunity to get those connections between people who are going to go ahead and make sure your game gets sold in retail and have that shelf life cycle at retailers. And they do so based on how well campaigns do. If a campaign gets 2,000 backers, you'll have a much easier time picking up a retail partnership than if your campaign has 150 backers. So the popularity of campaigns in and of themselves can determine the viability of the retail lifecycle for that game. And so inherently, you get to a certain point where people want both options. They want to crowdfund their game. They want to bring their game to life. They want that marketing, they want that pre-funding, they want all the reasons that crowdfunding exists. But they also want to sell that game down the road. And they want to have a longer life cycle of where the game exists, so it's not just relegated to a crowdfunding campaign and then a reprint and expansion 2 years later. You want that retail life cycle. And the problem is, as soon as that happens, you're now trying to deal with two audiences. Because the inherent problem you're going to start with is the fact that when you do this, you're trying to create a structure and an incentive where people will buy your game during the crowdfunding period, because that's why you have it, but they'll also buy the game during the retail period because that's why you have it. And so why are people going to buy from either or both of those periods? There's inherently going to start being a bit of a dynamic in play where it's hard to support both effectively. And we will come back to that soon. So we're going to come back to the dynamic as to why it's hard to do both effectively. But let's first talk about the fact that retail availability comes in generally three ways. When you see a game that was on crowdfunding and you later see that game at retail, there's usually three core options as to why that is. The first option is that the backers are retailers. Meaning there's no control, there's no agency. You have a game and maybe they have a, buy 3 of the game for $70 a piece or whatever it is. And board game stores come in and they back that game at the same price point that you as a traditional backer would buy, just so they have access to that game. That is one option available, and you just have stores who are simply backing the game at the same price point you paid for it to have that game to sell, maybe at a markup, maybe not, depends on their reasons or why. Maybe they're international and otherwise people can't get the game. There could be a lot of reasons to do so. But you're often talking about a store that is very low margins, but for all intents and purposes, they are simply a backer of that campaign. Meaning to the person who's selling and producing the game, you, the person buying the game to play, and Joe, the person buying 20 copies to sell at a store, are the same except for the amount that they're buying. You're both paying the same price point, there's no special terms, there's nothing that the board game creator can do about that scenario. It is the rarest of the three, but it does happen. There are reasons to still pay full price for a game and still be able to profit on that game. The second reason, second way, which tends to be more common, is retailer pledges. You have a situation where the creator of the campaign is, they have their campaign's available, and they have an option, go ahead and contact us for retail pledges. And so let's just use fake numbers over here for a second. The game might cost, $80 for you, and then the retail pledge might cost anywhere from $70 all the way down to generally about half is the lowest you'll see, usually. So that $80 game for you might cost as low as $40, but I would say a more common range is going to be between $50 to $70 is the more common range you'll see for a retailer pledge on a crowdfunding campaign. I mean, there's almost always going to be a discount once you do retailer pledges. The question is, how severe is that discount? It might be as simple as, hey, buy a case of 6 and we'll throw an extra one free, which would work out to around that, $10 discount on $70 or whatever, on $80. But again, there's some form of discount for a retailer to go ahead and back multiple copies. They're still effectively a backer, but they are a backer of a different category. They're being given some special treatment as far as the pricing, and the reason they're giving that special treatment, the reason they are being given that special treatment, is because for the creator, it's a way to get their games into more hands. It's a way to expand their reach and create a larger, longer life cycle around their product, starting with the crowdfunding campaign. The third option is going to be post-campaign distribution. This just deals with the fact that the creator, whether they do it ahead of time or whether they plan it doing the campaign after the campaign, whatever, they have a post-campaign distribution. They have their game not going through the actual campaign itself, but just the nature of, hey, we sold 2,000 copies, we produced 5,000 copies, 3,000 copies went into distribution, they went through our usual partners, whoever those partners might be. At this point, by the way, there's an entire ecosystem of people who connect, we'll come back to the ecosystem soon. But either way, you have the post-campaign distribution, it's nothing to do with the campaign itself, you just made enough copies, or you will continue to make copies. Maybe you only produced 2,000, but now your second print run is going to be an additional 3,000 copies, and you go ahead and deal with post-campaign distribution to get your game into stores. Those are the three ways games get into stores, just so you're generally aware. The most common three ways. There can obviously be other things, but those are going to be the most common three ways. The challenges that creators face in pricing is the difference between the perception of the game on Kickstarter and on retail, and at retail. Because effectively you have a situation where they have to price their game in a way that maintains the pricing value of the game. Because there's usually a 5 times cost value in board games. It's a 5 times multiplier in play, although I've seen many people say that it's really nowadays more of a 6 or 7 times multiplier, where effectively it's how do you actually distribute the profit of a game. And I'll use the 5 times as an example because I think that's a more common, easy one to understand, and I'll talk about why it's 6 or 7 shortly. But the 5 times cost, and we're going to use a $100 game for simplest terms over here. A $100 game effectively should cost $20 to produce. A $100 game costs $20 to produce. Because the math of that $100 game, and this is something we've talked about before, but it's always good to have that full clarity for people who haven't seen every single video I've ever made or aren't aware of these numbers. I also highly recommend checking out Jamie Stegmeier's blog. He has an excellent blog that goes through the entire nature of running a business in the board game space. But the $100 board game, ideally it costs $20 to create. It means the factory is getting $20 to create the game. You, as the person who, let's take a second. So the factory should cost $20 to create the game. Then you turn around and sell it to a distributor for $40. So you sell that $100 game to a distributor for $40, which means you've paid the factory $20, you've gotten $40 from the distributor, so you've made $20. As the project creator, you made $20 on the game, and then $20 goes to the factory, so those are the first 2 bundles. The distributor takes that game and turns around and sells it to the game store for $60. So that $100 game is being sold from the distributor for $40 to $60 to the game store. So again, the distributor made $20, the factory made $20, you made $20, and the game store now has a $100 game that they paid $60 for. And then the game store turns around and sells it for between $60 to $100, depending if you're dealing with full MSRP and a traditional game store, or alternatively online retail, any of that. So that $60 game at an online retailer might be sold for $80, an in-person store that has higher costs might be sold for $90 to $100 instead. And that's going to be your 5 times multiplier. The $100 game cost $20 to produce, you made $20, the distributor made $20, and the game store itself made between $20 to $40, depending on the structure of the game store. These are all rough numbers, but they should give you a different idea as to why everyone needs a piece of this pie. Why your expensive board games are so expensive, despite the fact that plastic is cheaper, and you know it's cheaper, and you're wondering, well, they're making tons of money. No one person is making tons of money. This is an essential life cycle to get your games that you want into your hands. And it is an essential life cycle. The game has to make a profit for the creator. That's $20 there. The game has to be produced. That's $20 there. The game has to be sold to you. That's $20 there. And the only way to eliminate tiers is to eliminate either the game store, which you can do by buying directly from a company, or to eliminate the distributor, which is complicated, and you may not understand as much about that one, but we'll explain that one in a second. So if you buy the game directly from the company, you do eliminate tiers of pricing effectively, but think about your own game purchases and how easy it is to buy games from Game Nerds, from Miniature Market, from whatever store you tend to frequent, versus what it would be like if every single game had to be bought from the creator themselves. There is a cost to the infrastructure, there's a cost to convenience, there's a cost to your friendly local game store. Distributors exist, by the way, because local game stores, even local game stores, if you think you'd have a hard time buying from every individual creator, local game stores have the same problem. They can't go to every single person who makes a game and connect themselves to the game. Even just things as simple as case quantities would be impossible to deal with on a practical level. A distributor consolidates all the games from all these creators into a single place to give game stores the opportunity to go ahead and buy from them. All these tiers are essential for the convenience factor. Now, the reason it's sometimes referred to as the 6 or 7 times rule nowadays, the reason why that multiplier has gotten worse, is because sometimes you have this new tier in place, which is an agency that connects the distributor to the game store. The scene in the board game space is more and more competitive. It's more competitive than it's ever been before. Everyone and their brother wants to make a board game. And that means that, and crowdfunding has allowed that to happen, but it means that distributors can't take on everything because a lot of things that they would take on just aren't good enough to be able to sell. And so there's a new tier of customer in place. There's a new tier of profit center in place in which, well, profit center makes you money. There's a new cost in place, in the sense that you now have agencies that find people who make games and they say, we've vetted these games, we've determined that they're good, and you as a distributor should take on these games. They will probably sell, make you money. We've vetted these games. I mean, there's almost a degree of vetting that needs to be gone into just to get your games to distributor, which introduces a new cost area to the games. These are all the problems with producing games in general, because games are, paper, plastic, a little bit of, cardboard. That's cheap enough on the whole, but these costs all do add up. And that's why you have these multipliers in place. Now, the problem with the pricing perception of a game on Kickstarter versus retail is inherently on crowdfunding, you could theoretically charge less for a game and make more money. There are asterisks there are caveats there, but as a general pure level, a game that's being sold where you eliminate the distributor, you eliminate the game store, should make more money for the creator. This is where you get to the part where game stores or game creators on crowdfunding are often smaller. There are costs that go into running a crowdfunding campaign, and there's also the logistics factor of who gets the games and how they get the games. Speaking frankly, you buying a bunch of games but you buying 6-7 games at once from Miniature Market is going to result in a lower cost per game on the shipping and logistics side of things than you trying to get your game from a crowdfunding campaign. And that's not a cost that the creator is making, that's just a cost that you have to endure. And so inherently there's this weird structure at play in crowdfunding. I think I've used the word inherently like 7 times so far in this video. But in this crowdfunding structure, you have the opportunity to cut out some costs, but you do have new costs added in. You also have some revenue thresholds, so you're sharing money with Kickstarter or GameFound, or whoever's taking a percentage there. That's on top of the regular crowdfunding, regular credit card processing rates and whatnot. Not a huge amount, it's like 5%, but nonetheless, it's present. There's all the marketing that goes into it, there's the buzz, there's the hype, there's all these things that go into a crowdfunding campaign that aren't present otherwise. And so you do have these different cost structures, but different cost eliminations, but you still, as a creator, have to enforce the value perception of your games on crowdfunding versus retail. Because let's say for a second that you as a creator can go ahead and say that you're going to make, less money on your game. You can afford to sell the game for less on crowdfunding. Let's pretend you could. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. It's not always clear. A lot of it depends on the infrastructure cost, the fixed cost of that business. But in some cases, maybe you could. Maybe you could sit there and say, hey, the game would normally cost $100 at retail. I've done the math and I can afford to go ahead and sell it for $70 in crowdfunding and still break out even. The problem is, if you are taking into account the long-term life cycle of your game and the cost value at retail, then even though you might be able to make money at $70, you still have to maintain the value aspect of the game, because if you turn around and sell your game for $70 on crowdfunding and then tell all the retailers, hey, you know that thing that I just sold for $70 to everyone? I'm going to have you sell it for $100. The value perception is going to be ruined. Distributors and retailers are going to be less likely to take on a game that everyone else perceives as being overpriced. Now, it does happen, but it does face those hurdles, which means creators have to balance those hurdles on top of everything else. They have to balance the hurdles of making sure a game costs a certain amount at crowdfunding, because if they don't, then the value perception of the game is going to be ruined at retail. This is something all creators have to take into account if they are trying to take into account the long-term longevity and life cycle of their game. The tricky part is creators need to inherently give backers a reason to back now. Because they could rely on a few reasons. Any creator can rely on a few reasons why someone backs a game. But if you are bringing your game to crowdfunding and you're bringing your game to retail, you have to give backers a reason to want to pay money today for something that inherently has more issues with buying it today. The first issue is the lack of the review economy. You're going to have less reviews. Both users and content creators are going to have less actual reviews, and opinions on that game are going to be in existence. So inherently, you're saying, I said inherently again, you are asking people to spend money today with less information than if they spend money tomorrow. There's the time value of money. If a game costs $100 today and $100 in a year and a half from now, that $100 is worth less a year and a half from now. You could have done stuff with it today, and so there's a time value of money in play. There's the risk factor of crowdfunding. It's a small risk. Most games do deliver, but it is still a risk. So if the costs are the same, why would you ever buy it today when you can buy it in the future instead? You have to give people a reason to be willing to spend money today, and that's where there's a lot of little sub-reasons that all go into trying to get someone to back something in crowdfunding. One of those reasons is simply support the creator. This game would not exist. This game would not be able to exist unless you help back this game, which is a reason to a certain extent, but ultimately bringing the game to life only works until the part where the game is funded. After that, there's just more people jumping on the train. Versus supporting the creator, that's possibly true. If the creator is making an extra $30 on the crowdfunding game as opposed to what they would at retail later, well then good. Why not give the money to the creator, the person making the game? As a backer, maybe that's a value to you. It is a value to me. I don't know if I'd be willing to pay more for that, but I'd be willing to pay the same for that. The time value of money versus the idea of helping support people who are making the games. I mean, don't get me wrong, distributors and retailers also need to be supported, but I do have, I guess, more of a feeling of wanting to support the person who brought this thing to life as opposed to the person who's selling the thing. My own personal preference, you can go ahead and go with yours. Limited accessibility is going to be a big deal. Sometimes you can't get a game at retail as easily, especially if you're an international consumer, and getting on crowdfunding can give you that option, that limited accessibility. Getting the games early can be a big deal, although that also comes with complexity, by the way. To you, it might be very easy to sit there and say, well, crowdfunding backers should get their games before retailers. The reason this is complicated is, I guess, a few reasons. First of all is the fact that if the retailer is simply a backer, then you can't really control for who gets the game early. So the perception that retailers will get their games at the same time or earlier than other backers will happen because Joe Schmo retail store bought 20 copies and a bunch of people put it on social media and are upset that these games exist before they got their copies. But if you're just part of the crowdfunding ecosystem, sometimes there's not much the publisher can do about that. Even though when there are times you can do it with that, there is complexity to sitting there and saying, hey, we're going to produce 5,000 copies of this game, 2,000 for backers, 3,000 for retail, but we're going to make sure not to sell those 3,000. We're going to ship them, we're going to give them to distributors, but we're just going to tell distributors you can't buy that game for an extra few months. These games are being shipped across giant freight ships or whatever it is across the ocean. Unless you're willing to do 2 separate waves, unless you're willing to pay for freight a separate time, you're stuck in a situation where you're asking the distributors not to sell the thing that they're going to have access to, which is inherently complicated. It's not doable, but it's not as simple as being like, oh yeah, we'll just, do waves. You get your wave now, you get your wave later. There are complexities to this that very often backers don't take into account. I'm not saying you can't do it. I'm saying it's just more than simply oh yeah, we'll just sell the games later. There's the FOMO aspect. FOMO is a big reason to getting things on crowdfunding. The FOMO, the uncertainty of will this game be available later or not? You never truly know. And the last reasons are going to be pricing and exclusive content. Pricing and exclusive content turn to the monetary aspect of things, where it's not just about supporting the creator, it's not about FOMO, it's not about getting it early, it's not about all these other factors, it's about the fact that you're getting a better deal, either through more exclusive content, or alternatively, through a better price. Those are going to be reasons why you give people, those are reasons you give your backers as to why they should get their games today instead of tomorrow. Which is where the whole Game Nerds situation comes to a head. The entire Game Nerds situation, the Game Nerds, Trayz situation, is that they effectively did try to encourage their backers, this is going to be a better price point. Getting it on crowdfunding now is going to be a better price point. Yes, you're supporting the creator. Yes, you're getting it early. Yes, all these other things, but you're also getting a better price point. And when you say better price point, something I've complained about a lot is the idea that creators sit there and say, oh yeah, it's $100 MSRP and you're getting it for $90. Look at the deal you're getting. In reality, it's going to be cheaper than $90 in retail and you're paying $15 shipping. You're paying more than later, which I can't stand when a creator touts a better price as a reason to get it now when it's actually not a better price. In the case of Game Trayz, they were aware of the actual pricing. They weren't sitting there playing these games. Kudos to them. They were aware of actual pricing. Their goal was to go ahead and give backers a better price to get it now as opposed to waiting for later. The problem is, whatever happened behind the scenes wasn't communicated the way it should have been. And so Game Nerds ultimately has a higher price point, a lower price point than that price point that they would need when you take into account price plus shipping in order to have guaranteed or incentivized their community get the game now. And that results in a weird dynamic. A weird dynamic in which it is weirdly a win, a weird win. It is weirdly a win for Game Trayz to reach out to Game Nerds and say, no, please raise the price on that game, which does make the game more expensive than for your average person who didn't get the game in the past, but it is doing so in order to respect and honor a prior commitment that was made. It's an icky feeling win. That's why I sit there and say the best situation would have been to never have had that happen. Because the problem is to let the lower price exist is doing a disservice to those people who you tried to get to back your game through a commitment. I don't know if it's a commitment or an attempted commitment or we'll try. I don't know the exact wording. But whatever it is, what you told your community, you can either let the lower price exist and sit there, and now you have, to some extent, you lose trust within your community the next time you try to sit there and say, here's a reason to back. Because you're teaching and training people, hey, don't back the games on crowdfunding, just wait for retail, it'll be cheaper. There is a negative end result of letting that lower price sit. But raising the price does have the negative result of making other people pay more just to preserve a sense of a deal. The problem is preserving a sense of a deal does matter. It matters not just for Game Trayz and their future campaigns, it matters for the ecosystem in general. Once upon a time, crowdfunding gave people great deals left, right, and center. And nowadays, there are less financial reasons, not less reasons, there are less financial reasons nowadays to back games than there were 5 years ago. The ecosystem has changed. It was changing already before COVID, and COVID just made things worse, showing us the weak spots within the ecosystem and how people weren't building enough profit into their ability to produce the games that any small issue, any small road bump made the entire thing collapse. And that's just not good for the crowdfunding space. And if it's not good for the crowdfunding space, it's also not good for the creation of mom and pop publishers who are able to start up and constantly keep this space free from being dominated by a handful of big companies. It'll always be infiltrated with tons of people who are simply able to bring their ideas to life, which is why preserving the sense of value that crowdfunding has, despite the fact that it comes at this weird situation where you raise the price for your average consumer, I do think is a net good. It's a complicated net good, but it is a net good, in my opinion. That's kind of a, 20-minute wrap-up of the nature of publishers, retailers, creators, and how you're trying to balance this weird dynamic where you need to give people reasons to buy the game at any point. Because the reasons to back a game, we have some of those things. Again, pricing, supporting the creator, early access, exclusive content, those are all FOMO, those are all reasons to back. The reasons to wait till later, first of all, the basic one is you didn't know it existed at the time. You weren't aware of Game X, or you weren't a gamer at Game X. Whatever the reason is, you didn't have the opportunity to buy it because you weren't aware, so you buy it later. The better pricing can be a reason to buy it later. Maybe you get exclusive content in the crowdfunding campaign, but you get better pricing later. That's a very common tier. Exclusive content, better pricing. Both are winning in one different way. More review access is another reason to buy it later. You have more reviews, more information. The certainty that the game exists and there's not some, who knows what's going to happen with the creator. Certainty of your own life situations, your game group, your game collection, whether you even like Euro games anymore, all of those things. There's lots of reasons to get later. There's lots of reasons to get now. For the ecosystem to properly work, you kind of have to ensure that there's always reasons in both camps to go ahead and back or buy a game. And that's your little roundup of retailers and publishers and all that. In any case, and until next time, I hope this information was informative in some way. And as always, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. I hope you enjoyed this video. And as always, I hope you have a good one.